Welcome to the Plant Cunning Podcast,
where we explore a relationship to plants, other people, and the mysteries of nature.
Coming to you from the high Allegheny Plateau in central New York.
We are your hosts, A.C. Stauble
and Isaac Hill. Episode 69, The Delightful Phyllis Delight. Phyllis is a traditional Southern Appalachian folk herbalist. She's a little bit of a legend, and this is a lot of fun. We talk about Southern folk medicine, about growing up in Alabama, and in a family of herbalists and midwives that goes back to at least the Civil War, about her amazingly diverse bioregion, about the amazing versatility of decoctions, about how traditional healers would be able to make many different remedies from one plant based on how long you boil it down, and how you can boil down stuff like mullein and Queen Anne's lace, and stuff that you wouldn't think that you should decoct, and about wild yam, which really should be dried and decocted according to Southern folk medicine. Phyllis also shares stories about some of the legendary herbalists that she studied with, like Tommie Bass. And she gives us some good tips on books, like Dr. Christopher's Herbal. We had a very delightful conversation with Phyllis. We went about 2 hours, so I took the second half and put that up for the patrons. And in part 2, we talk about daughter, about some other crucial medicines, about energetics, or as she likes to say, the qualities of plants, and vitalism, and a lot of other really excellent stuff. So I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you'd like to hear part 2, go on over to patreon.com/plantcunning. Okay, so today on the Plant Cunning Podcast, we have Phyllis Delight. How are you today, Phyllis?
I'm doing good. How are y'all?
Very good.
Yeah, it's kind of a warm day for central New York in February. It's like almost 40, so that's nice.
And it's 60 in Alabama.
Yeah, that's even nicer. That's probably a really good time of the year for Alabama. I guess does it get really hot in the summer?
Typically it does get really hot in the summer, but the last couple of summers, it's been really weird. Like last summer, I didn't have to turn my air conditioning on except for a couple of days, which is a real first. But I know friends up in Minnesota and New York and up in the Northeast, they were like, it's like a heat wave up here. And it just felt like everything reversed last couple of years.
Wow.
So we only got like 92 or 93, which is normally we're like 100, 101, 102. So it was a big difference last year. It was like we had a really extended late spring, a really early fall, lots and lots of plants. Oh my God, I'm in a semi-tropical area. I'm in North Alabama, the end of the Appalachians, but it's classified semi-tropical. So if you don't mow your yard, weed your garden, within 2 or 3 days, the plants are literally taking over. And it's not just kudzu that grows a foot a day. It's everything that grows a foot a day.
The gardening is more about just maintaining in the
Oh,
last
yeah.
Huh.
Yeah, it's, you go, I just weeded this 2 days ago and these things, grass is already coming up. So everything grows here really quick, and it's we have lots of rain. Typically, we usually get about anywhere from 60 to 80 inches a year.
Nice.
Yeah. Excluding those special El Nino drought years.
Right.
Right. So, it really is a plant paradise. And as a matter of fact, Alabama, I think, is listed as number 4, maybe number 5 in the nation for biodiversity.
Yeah.
Right. So
Cool.
I'm really fortunate where I live. It's the foothills of the Appalachians. So it's elevation and slightly mountainous. And a lot of the plants that grow, from Pennsylvania on down, that don't require super cold, they grow here. But I'm also about 4.5 hours away from the Gulf Coast. So in between me and the Gulf Coast is the prairie, which we call the Black Belt, because it's prairie with this really rich, deep black dirt. And it's where echinacea grows wild and the buffaloes roamed back in the day.
Yeah.
So there's all of those plants that grow there, totally different, right? So there I've got rattlesnake master and fairy wand. Fairy wand is also called false unicorn.
Okay.
So, right. So in the woods and in the prairies around that area. And then a little further down, we've got the bog plants, because the Mobile River Basin is considered the most biodiverse river in the United States.
Wow.
It's actually, they call it the Little Amazon because there's so much biodiversity. And more bog plants, more sundews, more carnivorous plants. And then a little, like an hour away from that, we're on the Gulf and all the Gulf plants. So if I just stayed in Alabama, I would never run out of plants, right?
Yeah,
and I will never discover them all either, right? There's just too many.
Totally. And it's interesting to hear that it is like considered a tropical region, because or almost tropical. Because when I visited Alabama, I was pleasantly surprised by how much it felt like the Northeast in certain ways, like all of a lot of familiar trees and plants. I was there in the springtime and it felt like Northeast in the summertime. So,
what part of Alabama were you in?
I was in the northern part. I forget.
Yeah, that's the edge of the Appalachians.
Yeah. Okay.
Right. With the elevation, the mountains up around Mentone and Northeast Alabama.
Yeah.
Just south of Chattanooga. So the mountains that run through Chattanooga, like Lookout Mountain, go all the way into Alabama.
And then those mountains run all the way up to here.
Yeah, we're at the
That's right. That's right. So that part is like the Northeast. And I liken it more to like maybe some of the plant stop at Pennsylvania. But I'm going to tell you, those hardwood trees, like the oaks and the hickories and the sycamores and all these wonderful hardwood trees you would think about, grow all the way to the Gulf Coast.
Wow.
And all the way down to Costa Rica. If you've ever been to Costa Rica, you'll see a lot of the same trees. And if you go into Mexico, you'll see a lot of the same trees. So the hardwood forest is, I'm going to say, not indigenous to what we think of as being just in the Northeast or just being in the South. I mean, there are some tree differences.
Yeah.
For example, I know New Jersey had the Great Pine Barrens, and where there were nothing but the pines back in the day, and lower Alabama and Georgia, we had the Great Pine Forest, where, even into Louisiana, Mississippi and Louisiana, across that swath. And Alabama used to be the #1 producer of turpentine in the nation.
And
because
comes from the pines, which
comes from the pines, if you don't know that, right? Because we had this giant natural pine forest in South Alabama. So so these trees are until you get up into, I guess, the boreal kind of forest, where we have truly only conifers or maybe redwoods and conifers. It's amazing how these deciduous trees really go much further south than folks think they do, right?
Yeah. Where we are, we're starting to get into the northern hardwoods. We have a lot of birches and maples and beeches, but they're starting to die out. But I wonder how far those go down too. But it's really amazing how adaptable that bio community is.
Yeah, we have river birch, and we do have some maples. And in a cold winter, because I think you have to have to tap a maple tree at least 2 months of cold. You might need 3, but I'm here. People, if we get 2 months of really cold and the sap goes down, we're like, oh yeah, let's go out and tap some maple. Let's tap some hickory, because hickory, oh my God, hickory syrup is amazing. If you've never had tapped a hickory tree. So these were the kind of things that I grew up with doing, because, basically back in my day, youth, we were just super poor and everybody did this. You had to forage, you had to live off the land, you had to have a garden. But, these are the things that have come back too, that, the foraging community is into. So like this winter, we haven't had 2 months of hard freezing cold. The sap did go down, but I don't think tapping is going to be very productive this year, with the hickories and the maples. And we don't have a lot of maples, but we do have some. And what we have is mostly red maple. Hickory is our primary tapping tree here. So, and there are lots of hickories. So, and various different types and species, but we just haven't had, we had maybe, let me say, on New Year's Day, excuse me, on New Year's Day, it was 70 degrees here.
Oh, wow.
We had a really strange winter. So it didn't get cold until about the middle of January. And what is this? In the middle of, we've only had about a month of cold. So, and I was out yesterday, chickweed is coming up, the whole climate is so totally screwed. Everything is just so weird. Plants are adapting, but I'm having trouble.
Right. I was going to say, it's like, maybe that gives us hope in 50 years, if New York is like Alabama, we can still tap maple trees sometimes. But
or the hickories will move north.
Yeah. So we do usually ask our first question that, well, what brought you to the plant path? And you touched a little bit on that, but what brought you to the plant path?
Well, it was my family history and heritage and tradition. My grandmother, and this is on my daddy's side of the family, not my mother's. So on my daddy's side of the family, there was a long history of herbal midwives and herbalists in general, male or female. So my grandmother was herbalist, midwife, and helped deliver a lot of babies, helped take care of community, because back in her day, there were just no doctors here. And then the town area got a doctor, and then you had to go into town to get the doctor, and then he had to come out, and he had a horse and buggy. This was her time period. So it seems like that was a whole long time ago, like hundreds of years ago. But, Alabama, kind of this deep South, because of the economic devastation following the Civil War and then the Great Depression, the Deep South lagged behind the country in services and that they offered the population. Electricity wasn't here. Nobody had electricity when she was growing up. It just wasn't even here. Nobody had natural gas. It wasn't here. And so we think about the Northeast at this time, it was quite developed. And, people had water in their homes and electricity in their houses. Well, that wasn't the case here. So everything was still in great poverty, unless you were in a big city like Atlanta, Georgia, for instance, where there was money to have these kind of things. So the doctor here initially went to the houses in a horse and buggy in her time period. And then he got a car. But it's still like, even when I was a young girl, the doctors were all still making house calls. There was just that time frame. So my family also, for pocket money, for winter hard cash, were wildcrafters. So I grew up wildcrafting. Started when I was about 10 in the woods, going with my family to wildcraft. Mostly ginseng, pink root was another big one, stillingia. We basically gathered whatever the market might be at that time, whatever was going to sell. And then my grandmother, there was always a few herbs that she kept around. She didn't dry a lot of herbs. She just would, she was of the, let's see how to say this, had Native American heritage. And it was like, pretty much whatever you need is growing outside in the yard or the back door, or just run out in the woods and get it. And they might dry a few things to overwinter, like ginseng was always harvested and dried. Golden seal that was around was usually harvested and dried. Just a few things, but not a lot, because it'd be popping right back up before long. So mostly fresh stuff and simples. She probably only knew, seriously, 10, 15, 20 herbs, but she knew how to use them. And this is how I was taught. You learn how every single thing a plant can do, and then you don't need 150 plants. What do you need 150 plants for if you have 20 that you are really experienced with and that can do everything?
Yeah.
All right. So that was my early training as a simpler. We call that a simpler, which is which is a little bit different definition than simpler has become up in the Northeast with maybe the Susan weed infusion. So this is this is, here in the South, a simpler was someone who knew every single thing you can know about a plant, and you can do 150 things with it because you know everything the plant can do and in what circumstance the plant can do it, and how long to cook it, and how much a person needs to take.
Right.
So it was also decoctions, no infusions, didn't really have alcohol. Number one, it was still illegal. Right. So you couldn't even get it unless somebody made something, and then that was
really expensive.
Well, it was also really nasty. It was called a rot your gut liquor. And it was they just kind of made it for the money, and who knows what was in it. And they weren't savvy. They used the wrong, a lot of times, tubing. You can't use copper. There's certain lead, you can't use lead salt, so there was this whole thing about old-fashioned steels. On my mom's side of the family, they were all bootleggers, so I know this crap. And they all ended up in the pen and going to jail too. All my great uncles, they were in and out of the penitentiary all the time because they were bootlegging. So we just didn't have alcohol. Everything was cooked in kind of like a more traditional, I would say, native approach. But also that kind of decoction is also traditional to all folk medicines, to Scots Irish folk medicine. You cooked it, right? You didn't infuse it. So infusions here were considered beverages, and medicine, you cook the plant to get the deep medicine out because it's in there deep, and just infusing it for 10 or 15 minutes was not going to do that. Unless it was a really strong plant and you were beveraging it. And it was like sassafras tea. Oh, let's have a cooling beverage. Let's infuse it. Or sumac berries. A cooling tea. Let's infuse it. They were considered beverages that kind of help relax you or cool you off, but not medicine at that point. You still had to cook the sumac to get the medicine if you wanted kidney medicine, or you had to cook the sassafras root. You had to decoct it if you wanted the medicine.
Well, what about like leaves? Like, if things are more delicate, would you still boil them down that much?
Yep.
Okay.
Because even things you think are delicate aren't really. And also here, everything was like, is this native or did this come with the settlers? I mean, there was still this big kind of like difference made with plants. So, you know, natively speaking to the land, there weren't a lot of delicate plants. Everything were roots and barks and heavy grasses. When we think about chickweed, it's not native. We think dandelion, it's not native. The Rugel's plantain is native, and it can take some cooking. It's a tough. We think about English plantain or narrowleaf plantain. It's not native. So a lot of the plants that herbalists typically use were not even native, right? Now they're naturalized, right? And chickweed is great medicine. It's a wonderful also food. And it can take a lot more cooking than you think it can, because we would just throw it in, but it was also considered settler medicine. And if you really wanted the deep medicine, let's go in the woods, let's go to the trees, let's go to the shrubs, let's go to the plants that were native to this land, to this region. So that's how it's taught. And I never, I use chickweed, I use dandelion, and I use, what's another kind of like common? Yellow dock.
Yeah.
Would be another one that came with the settlers.
Yarrow, maybe?
Yarrow came with the settlers. The other plantains came with the settlers. So those were considered useful. And they certainly are. And they're certainly, can do the job that you need doing, but those were not the first plants I was taught.
Right. So I'm wondering, just to kind of define some terms, like how do you define a Southern folk practitioner, or how do you define Southern folk herbalism?
Well, Southern folk medicine, other than Native American medicine, was the only regional herbalism to develop and sustain in the continental United States, right? Over a few hundred years, and changed, it grew, and it is I think an infusion of a lot of different cultures and systems coming together just for survival. Obviously immediately, Native American plant use was there, because this is their land, their plants, they knew how to use it. But Native Americans in the South, they took the initial brunt of a contact with Europeans and the devastation that went with that, as far as disease and death. And, I've read estimates that Native Americans in the Southeast, it was like 85% died. I've read 90, I've read different methods, but not methods, percentages, but suffice to say, it almost wiped them out. And, they had to figure out how to survive with just a few of them. And there was a lot of intermarrying with settlers, just because, who else is around, that took place. And then there was also a lot of isolation, like, we're going to go off and be not have anything to do with these folks too. So, but Native American plant use, for sure. Spanish. So the South was initially settled by the Spanish. They're the ones that came through. And so, like 100 years before the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock, the Spanish are bringing in people, bringing in horses, bringing in pigs, bringing in people to, go across the Southeast. So they brought their medicine with them, which was the humoral system. Mm-hmm. So the humoral system, it's also called Greek medicine, or the medicine of Galen, was the number one kind of mainstream medicine in Europe at this time period, was the humoral system, right? And so they brought that with them, and this began to kind of infuse with Native American practices and plant use, because pretty soon they're running out of whatever plants they brought with them, but immediately they start sending plants back to Spain. And some of my best references for that early plant exchange are in Spanish documents, because they were really good document keepers, about plants they're immediately like sending back to make money on, because that was the first thing. They can't find gold. Well, oh my God, here's a cayenne pepper.
Yeah,
right. And sassafras. Yes. And all these plants, they became plants of commerce before the Pilgrims even came to the Northeast. This is before.
Yeah.
Right. So we have this Spanish influence, and then of course we have African influence, and not so much on plants, because they didn't bring a lot of plants with them. How could they? Right. There's some written reports of them putting seeds in their hair to bring. That was licorice. But there's also debate of that was also a beauty thing to make your hair smell good. So mostly what came with the Africans was a spiritual framework on health. That got incorporated, and it's like an amazing spiritual framework. There's also let me see, the foods that came with them. I'm sorry, I got distracted a minute, kind of envisioning licorice smelling hair. Don't you know that would smell wonderful? Yeah, wouldn't that be great?
Yeah.
So, but they brought a lot of foods that ended up coming into the South, like peas and various peas, and of rice, obviously. But their spiritual framework on how to use plants, and this gets all kind of incorporated into the infusion. And I'm saying infusion because everybody is just trying to live, trying to survive. This is a survival issue. And then the kind of last overlay on this, of course, are an overlay that began about the same time as the Africans did, because so the African influence and the Scots-Irish, or especially the Irish influence, all came about the same time. So all that kind of got infused. So I really kind of see that Southern folk medicine is this infusion of all these different cultures that we can all make a claim to. We're, all this ancestry is all part of making it a sustainable, long-term, viable folk medicine, when a lot of other, no other folk medicine developed. And there's a lot of historical reasons. The South was isolated. Civil War, the Great Depression, Reconstruction, there's all these historical aspects that kept the area in poverty and helped maintain the concept of Southern folk medicine. And even now, you run across families where, oh yeah, we've always used yellow root. Well, my granddaddy taught me how to use yellow root, or my grandmother, used sycamore bark, or, whatever the plant might be, that have maintained, within the families that just kind of got passed on, even though the bigger concepts or the larger concepts of Southern folk medicine kind of didn't, except, my family did, because my grandmother learned from her mother, who learned from her mother. So on my dad's side of the family, we can trace an herbalist back to the Civil War, and kind of like before that, records, or because of the Civil War, a lot of records got lost and destroyed. But so that's
deep lineage there.
You weren't long answer to your question. It was my family's business, right?
Right.
Right. And I started when I was 10.
That's amazing. Yeah, that's so amazing. I think I heard on another podcast where you said how you went to a conference or something and everyone was talking about Chinese medicine, but and they said like there's no American herbalism, and you're like, well, I've always been practicing that. There is. Right.
There is, like, who have you forgot this whole part of the country where the Southern folk medicine maintained? And then about an hour from me, up in the north mountains at the end of the Appalachians, lived Tommie Bass. And
cool. Right? I wanted to ask you about him.
Yeah. So Tommie Bass was also somebody I studied with and worked with for quite a number of years. And he also practiced this infusion of Southern folk medicine. And he started when he was 7. Now, I want to back up and say that he is of English descent, and Bass is an English name. And his grandparents and his dad and his mom were all English folk herbalists. So when they immigrated to this country, they brought English folk medicine with them. And Bass's salve became really famous in our area because it was this kind of combination of only native plants, but based on English folk medicine concepts. And I would dare say his mother, because of kind of the isolation of where they lived up in the mountains, I would truly dare to say that her lineage was probably more true, or as true English folk medicine as you would find anywhere in England at this day, because it wasn't diluted, right? They immigrated with a full system that they brought with them, and because of isolation and poverty, it didn't change.
Yeah.
Right. So it maintained that undiluted. But Tommie started working for Aunt Molly Kirby, who was a Black herbalist midwife at the foot of the mountain. Him and his family lived on top of the mountain. She lived at the foot of the mountain down by the river. And she started training him when he was 7. Cool. Now, because nobody in her community wanted to learn. And Tommie was a little white boy, and he wanted to learn because he was growing up with that English tradition, right? So she started teaching him. She just couldn't get up and down the mountains to gather the plants anymore. And so she started teaching him to gather for her and what they were used for. So he studied, we would say studied. Back then, that concept of study was more like an apprenticeship, like a really true apprenticeship.
Yeah. Even more than studying, really.
So not like doing and gathering, practicing and living it, rather than like a 2-week apprenticeship with a modern herbalist.
Right. This is what you did, right? From sun up to sundown, and you did what you were told. And if you gathered the wrong plant, well, then back up the mountain you had to go. Right. dodge the snakes and get it.
Yeah.
Right. So anyway, he started studying with her, and he did until she passed on. Now, he never was part of delivery. That was considered women's. So he never did any like labor and delivery, because she was a midwife, and there's no telling how many babies she delivered over her lifetime. But it was considered, no, you're a man, you can't do this. You can't even be present. So, but she did teach him how to use the herbs that could help keep a healthy pregnancy or help somebody get pregnant. But when it came down to the actual event, he was not allowed to be around. And that's, was what's the word I'm looking for? Modesty. And the culture of that time period. So he never participated in that. And so he studied with her until she just couldn't do it anymore. And then by that time, he was quite knowledgeable and was beginning to practice on his own. He was like a teenager. So he started actually practicing now, when we would think somebody is still in high school.
Yeah.
Right. But he was considered a grown man then. That was the time period. You're 17 years old, 18 years old. You are grown. You make your own living. You're your own person. So he did. And he started practicing herbalism. People started coming to see him because she had passed on. He also worked in the cotton fields. Everybody did. I did. My whole family did. When it was cotton season for that time period, you worked in the fields. And my grandfather on my mom's side was a sharecropper. We all had to work the fields. Everybody did. But he also fur trapped. He was a hunter and fur trapper, and had a license to fur trap. So in the state of Alabama, in order to gather wild plants legally from the woods, you have to have a fur trapping license. Except for ginseng, and ginseng has its own license.
Right.
Right. But it is there, but because of the touchy state of ginseng population, but you have to have a fur trapping license, and even the ginseng license is part of the fur trapping community and licensing. So Tommie was a fur trapper and a plant digger, but it all came under the same license. And then that allowed you to resell the plants to, companies that bought them, right? So anybody can gather a plant for their own use, and the government can't tell you what to gather or not gather on your own land. If you have ginseng on your land, they can't tell you what to do, right? But if you're gathering from other places, then you have to have this license. And so Tommie did. And so that's how he made his living. Plus he saw people. So that was Tommie. And so I was privileged to get to study with him too.
Wow. That's so cool.
Yeah.
That's
amazing.
really cool. So who were some of your other teachers and mentors?
Those were my two main ones. Okay. My dad, after my grandmother died, my dad took me out a lot, but my dad, he was never, he was a great plant identifier, but he only ever used 2 or 3 plants for, he was a super simpler. So ginseng to him could do anything. See, I'm serious. You cook this much ginseng, you decoct this much ginseng for this health issue.
So you would use different amounts for different times boiling for different issues?
That's right.
Okay.
And that's true of any plant that you might be sampling. Right. What you might want to use yellow dock for. We'll use yellow dock because a lot of people are familiar with it. If I went natively, I might say prickly ash, like a true prickly ash, not the Aurelia, but the xanthophyllum, right? How long are you going to cook this to get what you need out of it, right? And how much is too much? Wild yam, perfect example.
Ooh, yeah.
Wild yam, which still grows quite wild here and doesn't look, it's not missing, right? I know wild yam in other parts of the country are on the either endangered or at watch list. But if there's a bit of woods where I live, there's some wild yam growing in it. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So wild yam cannot be used fresh. It is, damaging to the mucous membrane tissues. If you use it fresh, it will rip your mucous membrane tissues. It will kill you simply because it will rip out your mucous membrane tissues from your mouth to your butthole. Ooh. All the way down. Yeah. It has to dry. And the old folks said it had to dry and age 6 months. So now, and artificial environments, they can dry it out a whole lot quicker. Mm-hmm. Right. Are y'all getting any background noise?
No.
Okay, good. No? Yes?
Maybe. Yeah, it's fine. Yeah. There's not really much.
Not distracting.
Yeah.
Okay. So it will rip that out like really bad. So it has to dry and age at least 6 months. So then after it's really dry, you go to cook it up. And when you first bring the water to the boil and the wild yam starts releasing, it is this beautiful bright red color. I mean, it's gorgeous. And it smells like butterscotch. Mm-hmm. It smells like you're cooking a dessert in your kitchen. So seriously, it is wonderful. So if you turn the water off then and have a sip, when it's like this pink red and smells like butterscotch, it absolutely is the most bitter thing you've ever put in your mouth. The
smells
smell,
like butterscotch, but actually,
it's more bitter than gentian. Wow. It's more bitter than ginseng. It's more bitter. I've never had anything more bitter.
Wormwood?
More bitter. It's a different kind. It's a different kind of bitter than wormwood, because wormwood has this oily bitterness to it that kind of clings to the back of your tongue.
Yeah.
Right. But wild yam, it doesn't have that oiliness. It doesn't cling. It immediately goes down. It immediately hits your bitter taste buds and you have swallowed it before you know it. And then it just feels like it's bitter all the way down into your gut. It feels like everything in your digestive tract is getting bittered in that moment, and you can really feel it. The most bitter thing. Now, if you keep cooking it a little bit longer, as the longer you cook it, the more burgundy it gets. Mm-hmm. And the more bitter it gets. You thought it was bitter before? Not. And from wild yam, the first birth control pills were made. Oh. It was, from wild yam, the first cortisone was made. It is the most hormonally active plant in the forest. The most hormonally active. Traditionally, back when, if you cooked it long enough, you had birth control. But you have to cook it a certain way, which I am not going to share because I don't want somebody trying it and not doing it right and going, oh my God, I'm pregnant. Yeah. Right. But it is super phytoestrogenic from that point of view. But studies have shown that it also affects progesterone receptors. So, and it's a natural steroid. So here we have a plant, the most hormonally active plant in the forest, and one of the most researched plants in the forest, especially back in the early 1950s, 60s, 70s, because pharmaceutically they were making things out of it. And people kind of have forgotten how to use it.
Yeah.
In the herbal community. How do you use it in the herbal community? Who uses it in the herbal community?
Well, they probably just make a tincture anyway.
They probably make a tincture. That's exactly right. And you're not getting the full benefit of the plant. And hopefully they are still making the tincture from the dried plant. As you should. Don't ever use the fresh root.
Yeah,
tincture or any other way. So I wanted to put that out there, that as a traditional herbalist, we had to know this kind of stuff.
Right. Yeah.
Right. We had to know what was safe, what was not safe, how to process it in the kitchen to make it safe. If it wasn't, how long do you dry this? So, now you just kind of order from your favorite company and it comes dried. Or if somebody you might forage, or you might know somebody that does forage, is kind of a part-time job. But there's a lot of this information that has gotten lost, kind of, if you see what I'm saying.
Yeah, for sure. And because you have to have so much experience with the plants and with decocting them to know, when, like, even with cooking, it takes a while to like get your taste and your eye. So, when something's done, when it needs a little bit of this, a little bit of that. But you have to have that like physical experience, like from having done it and tasted it and looked at it and seen how it is at each different stage. To
do it. And that was the tradition here. Southern herbalists still do this and, still teach it. But it's not taught or utilized in the same way in the broader herbal community. And I'm not saying people don't make infusions or decoctions, because obviously they do. But I feel like there's this gap of information that has been left out simply because I don't think most people know it.
Yeah. And all the nuances.
Yeah, the nuances, which these nuances can make a huge, huge difference in helping the body heal. Right. Yeah. So when you cook wild yam like this, you only need one sip.
Wow.
Seriously. Yeah, seriously. It is medicine on your tongue, and your body knows it. If you cook it up in this certain way, now you can preserve it in alcohol if you want. So the tradition here was, as I said earlier, decoctions, because that was the native, that was the folk medicine, that was the European folk medicine, that was to some extent European humoral system, although they already had alcohol tinctures coming in. But it was preserving it in alcohol after it was cooked was this whole other thing, right? This is how you could make it last if you needed to, but first you had to get the medicine out.
Right.
And for a lot of plants, that was a decoction of some sort. Now that's tradition. Now we know medicine makers, herbal manufacturers, they really investigated extraction methods in ways that my ancestors never could, or my teachers never did, because they were teaching what they had been taught. And this was the way
it
had been done. So I was having this conversation with David Winston not too long ago, and I was saying, traditionally, American ginseng is a decoction. You cook it up. You don't take an alcohol extract. What's missing in the alcohol extract that you're not getting? So here we always decoct it. Now, if we want to save it, now we're going to add some alcohol to it, or or even do a double extraction. So we're getting all the water soluble and then the alcohol soluble.
Right.
And that was what David was saying. You still have to have enough water in your alcohol extraction to pull out the water soluble bits that are so important. So truly, a lot of native plants decocting is getting the medicine, because there's all this water soluble stuff.
Yeah.
Phytochemicals. I'm saying stuff, folks. Phytochemicals, right? That need the water, as opposed to some, especially fat-based ones that need the alcohol. So it is kind of knowing this from a traditional point of view, expands your medicine, the strength of your herbal medicine, and then what you do with it. Right.
So anytime you make a tincture, might it be a good idea, instead of, if you're going to add water to your tincture, adding a decoction or infusion?
It depends. Yeah, again, depends on the plant. Like lobelia, it needs a double extraction.
Oh.
Yeah, but with vinegar.
Huh.
So if you want to get all the good stuff out of lobelia, which, grows wild, it's one of the few kind of grassy plants that's native here. It was the best is a vinegar. Vinegar is a double extraction, vinegar and then alcohol. Yeah, right. And vinegar extractions have their place, but they don't really get everything. So you have to, or all plants are not, you can't extract the usefulness from every plant with vinegar.
Right.
But lobelia is one that you can. So it's like knowing and understanding the plants on all different levels. And traditionally, people figured most of this out hundreds of years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Not longer. Yeah.
If not longer. And I'm not saying new information isn't useful. I cruise scientific papers all the time, because it is.
Yeah.
But let's not forget those hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years of usefulness and honing based on this empirical information of practice that's out there. Let's not forget that. And the rush to only look at what's on PubMed, or only look at the latest paper, or only say, oh, but there's no literature to back this up. Hey, let's go back 100 and kind of 50, 200 years. Let's look at traditional literature along with this. Let's not be kind of exclusively one way or the other. Again, maybe it's my background of infusion, but let's infuse both. And scientific and traditional. But what I'm seeing in the herbal community is this is a broader herbal community, that people are using fewer and fewer plants because they're not tested. Or they haven't been studied, and they're still not learning a lot of uses for those plants. They're still only looking at the uses of the plants that have been studied.
Right. It seems
right.
It's like, I feel like a lot of times the herbal community these days is just trying to be doctors, or like it's like they're looking for approval from the scientific community, and so they're only doing things that are approved by the scientific community.
Exactly.
This rich heritage of how, like, other ways of knowing, like experiential ways of knowing.
Exactly. And I think the internet also has a lot to do with that. If you Google, I don't know, let's say herbs for arthritis, you're going to get on 50 different websites, you're going to get the same 10 herbs.
Yeah. Man, Google stuff is just, it's like, it doesn't even help like anymore these days. It's much better to have a library, like, where you can actually look up in a book, because they all just like copy each other's top 10 herbs for this, or top 10
yes
herbs.
Yes.
Copying the same thing. And it's not even necessarily right. It's
Exactly. So I feel like this Google herbalism is really damaging the whole concept of herbalism in the broader context. Yeah. It's like, all right, and whatever the latest kind of researched herb is the one that gets on every single website. Right. So for a while it was boswellian. Black seed oil is the one out. It's on every website now. And I love black seed oil and it's super useful. But it's just like this same information over and over and over again. And even some of the newer herb books I pick up, it's still the same herbs that they got on Google, right? That somebody has made a book out of now. For the beginning herbalist, here's St. John's wort, chickweed, this ashwagandha, just the same herbs over and over and over. And I'm not despairing the herbs. They're wonderful herbs, but this information is a limited use of the plant because it's not given all the uses of the plant. Really kowtowing to research, dismissing tradition. And I just think it's damaging the whole concept and profession of herbalism across actually, parts of Europe and the United States.
So Phyllis, do you have any favorite herb books?
Yes. I like
a couple.
I'm sorry.
Well, you've written a couple too.
I've written some, but I'm going to exclude those.
Okay.
I do. I like Dr. Christopher's herb book. Anybody read that?
Dr. Christopher.
No,
Dr. Christopher.
No.
I have not.
Okay.
On the list.
Let me write that down.
Dr. Christopher.
Dr. Christopher's School of Natural Healing.
Okay.
And he was a traditional naturopath. So he called himself doctor. He was one of the best herbalists. So here again, he was practicing during a time period using mostly all native plants. Huge client basis. Out in parts of the Southwest in that area, California, when the rest of the country was going, or when part of the herbal renaissance saying there were nobody was practicing herbalism. Dr. Christopher he was one of Rosemary's Gladstar's teachers, if I'm not mistaken, but I know Michael Tierra studied with him. I know, he was actually the teacher of a lot of people who we think as herbal elders now.
Michael Moore, did he?
I don't know about Michael Moore. I don't know. But they were kind of out in the same area. Yeah. So I'm not going to say no, but I'm not going to say yes because I don't know. But so just opening his book, because I'm sitting right in front of part of my bookcase right now, he was the infusion. So the alternative herbs, chapter 2, he does plantain, red clover, poke root, burdock, chaparral, Oregon grape, blue flag, sassafras, sarsaparilla, echinacea, purple loosestrife, yellow dock, and garlic. Now he's doing all these from a clinical point of view from the I guess around 1930. I think he stopped practicing somewhere in 1970.
Okay.
And how to use them in a practice with stories and in formulas. What to use them with, where they grow.
Yeah.
All right. And this is a book that, a lot of people don't even have on their library shelves. And he was such a teacher to all these people that started the herbal renaissance.
Yeah. One of those links between, the old like eclectics, and back in the day when, a lot of doctors knew herbalism to
right
through that period where people were put in jail for practicing herbalism.
Well, and he was put in jail several times.
Really?
Wow.
One of his stories was he would leave in the morning. And so to gather his herbs, a lot of the times he functioned as a gardener and weeded people's gardens.
I guess this is before glyphosates.
Yeah, totally. So they had to have, gardeners to do the weeding. And one of the stories that is in his book is that he would leave in the morning and he would tell his wife, he said, he would say, if I'm not in jail, I'll be home for supper.
Oh.
He was in jail that many times.
Wow.
Where they would try to get him for practicing medicine without a license. And he was that popular and that successful.
Wow.
With his clients.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So he goes through, he kind of mixes, what settler herbs, the herbs that came from Europe with native herbs and native herbs from both the Appalachians and the Southwest. So he just mixed them kind of all together in his practice. But he had a practice and he has amazing formulas. And these formulas that he used and came up with are formulas that a lot of companies now have hijacked and are selling. Because they were so good. So his son has Dr. Christopher's formulas that you can buy in capsules or tinctures. But also I want to say Nature's Way, or, so his formulas are so useful that people got them and companies got them and started selling them. Here's a formula for a cough syrup. Just opened to a page. Comfrey root. Now we're going to go comfrey for a cough formula, for a Nervine formula. But he used it
these days.
No, you wouldn't use it these days, but his formula is comfrey root, turkey rhubarb, spikenard, skunk cabbage, horehound, and yellow dogs.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
So, and he's using all these plants. You just go out and find someplace.
Yeah.
Right.
Doesn't become find skunk cabbage in the Southwest though.
No, but like I say, he would order plants from other areas, herbs from other areas. So I also think that that when sometimes herbalists are study with someone and then they grow up and they want to make a name for themselves, they don't acknowledge their teachers the way they should. Right.
That's one thing I always try to do is ask people who their teachers were, because I think that's always very important.
Yeah.
Where you come from and
Right. I do too. So I always mention like Tommie Bass and my grandmother, because those were my dad, my principal teachers. But I'm in an unusual situation where I'm just here. I still live in the same town I was born in. Right.
Yeah. That's amazing. That's cool.
But, Dr. Christopher, all these herbalists came from all over the United States to study with him. Almost never hear anybody acknowledge that.
Yeah, that's a bummer.
Yeah, that is a bummer.
Yeah.
Well, I haven't heard of him, and I mean, he's, we got a decent amount of books on herbalism, but we don't have that book. So, thank you for sharing that with us.
Yeah, you're welcome. So there are quite a number, maybe a handful of herbalists from that time period that I think don't get acknowledged as much. And I've often wondered, one of the reasons I've wondered that this might be true is because they were had this really strong Christian base they were coming from, which most of their students did not. So I wondered if that kind of influenced the information getting carried on in some way, or the acknowledgement in some way. But I don't know. I'm just throwing that out there.
Yeah, another herbal teacher that was a teacher of the teachers is William Cessier. Am I saying that right?
Yeah. Cessier is right.
We also learned about him on the podcast interviewing Dina Falcone, who's an herbalist from New York. And it was just interesting that he influenced so many of the teachers that have influenced me, but I hadn't heard about him. And now this other.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So we got to make sure we keep, giving props to the teachers.
Yeah. And because he came up with that whole triune system.
Yeah.
That almost, that's being taught all kinds of places.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Right. So, yeah. Oh, awesome. Yeah. He was a big teacher of a lot of the teachers up in the Northeast. Another kind of like person who I think has tried to maintain some traditional information in their writing is Matthew Wood. Mm-hmm. And especially his Earthwise Herbal series, where he does New World plants and Old World plants.
Yeah. Such a classic.
It is. But I mean, that was kind of like one of the purposes there.
Right.
Is to, let's not forget how to traditionally use these plants, et cetera, et cetera. So I like him. And also there is, let me see, a book called A Reference Guide to Medicinal Plants by the University of North Carolina. And it's where they came and researched Tommie Bass and how he uses his plants.
If you'd like to check out part 2, go on over to patreon.com/plantcunning.